Hello, everyone.
Hello.
There is NLP Radio on the air again. And today in our studio, we are having Alexander Gerasimov, our usual speaker, and me, Olga Sarkisova. I am a linguist and a philologist. Let me first of all introduce you our guest, Alexander. Alexander is a famous Russian NLP trainer, NLP practitioner, NLP master, a famous negotiator in Russia, and the geography of seminars and trainings led by Alexander is 22 countries and 70 cities. Wow, Alexander, that's impressive.
Thank you.
Today, the topic we will discuss is called calibration. Calibration is something really hard to feel, to identify. We will discuss it from every side. First of all, Alexander, could you give a definition? What is calibration in NLP?
Calibration in the NLP language is the ability to see the difference. It is some kind of the power of observation, not the ability to notice a sport like Sherlock Holmes and to interpret it, but exactly the ability to see, to hear, to feel the differences. The human mind likes similarities, but it learns on differences. When we start seeing, hearing, and feeling a little bit more than it just seems to be, we become better and stronger and we get more experience. By my reckoning, calibration is one of the most critical skills that you always can develop. I think it is a skill which makes you a superhuman.
I believe so. Would you say, can everyone achieve this skill, acquire this ability to, to use this calibration in life? Is it accessible to anyone or to specific individual people?
Я думаю, да.
I think yes. Subject to a certain training process, nearly everyone can develop this skill. Even if a person with vision or hearing impairment can develop and improve this skill during special exercises and training. Plus, our nature provides for sensory compensation. For example, a hearing impairment person eventually begins to see better. Or, for example, a visually impaired person who cannot see well is able to recognize the tiniest difference during a phone conversation. Sensory compensation means that when one of our sensory receptors doesn't work properly, we will upgrade another sensory receptor.
Okay, so which means that anyone can acquire the skill of calibration, right? Sooner or later, but everyone can
Yes.
acquire it, can gain it. Okay. Do I understand correctly that when we discuss calibration and ability to be observant, observation ability, to be watchful, to identify the smallest details, do we talk of experts? Is it relevant to experts in some sphere or to anyone again?
Ну, например,
Well, calibrating skills will improve when your visual receptor is very busy. For example, an artist or a designer, or a person who is dealing with images, any images, the more such person becomes professionally skilled and experienced in a certain field, the more he or she begins to see what an ordinary person even doesn't notice. All those 50 shades of gray, leaning, color, gradation, gradient details, and such, while practicing, which can also be considered as some sort of training, a professional training, an artist, eventually becomes an expert. The ability not necessarily to see details, but to define size, color, distance, maybe the tiniest motions, all these can be trained. The specificity is that it is suggested that all this should be trained separately. The ability to define color gradients should be trained separately. When we look at some color and name it, for example, it's blue or it's red, for an expert, those are not just blue or red, those colors have some special names,
Mm-hmm.
and that expert is right in his way, because he considers two adjacent red shades, which we believe to be just slightly different, absolutely different, and a combination of another color with this shade won't go from his point of view.
Okay. Would you say that ability to use this calibration in different spheres, it's some kind of maybe extra ability of a person, kind of extrasensoric ability, or it is not?
By my reckoning, extrasensory perception is just a very well developed calibration skill.
Logical.
It is developed due to some natural causes. When a person has a very good eyesight or hearing, it may be developed due to his or her studying. For example, a music school graduate is able to easily define a certain note, which for me as an ordinary human is absolutely impossible. I have tried it for several times. If I play the piano, I can find out where do, re, and mi are and remember, but in a 5 minute, I have to make a fresh start. But visually, I can see all the tiniest details very good. I have rather good eyesight, and color gradients are pretty recognizable to me. So, through training, a person can develop extrasensory, extra-sensible skills.
Okay. Much more interesting to discuss will be calibrations of emotions, but maybe we'll get to that a little bit later. First of all, I still would like to get more to theoretical part, to structure, and to ask you maybe what does it depend on, the quality of your calibration, the distinctness, the exactness of calibrating something in any sphere, in any field? What does it depend on?
First, it depends on a person's attitude towards what he or she is calibrating. It surely has effect. Oddly enough, but any emotional expression adversely affects calibration. For example, when you look at something you hate or love very much, it will be more difficult to you to calibrate it, because emotions really influence.
You always say love is blind. Love is blind. It's exactly to this.
That was the first. While second, the human perceptual apparatus. For example, a person got tired or had some food or slept well. Being in a select state, he or she will be calibrating differently. A tired person naturally calibrates worse than, for example, a person who has slept well, glad, satisfied, without any distracting factors. Calibration depends on this parameter too. The third parameter having effect on calibration is motivation. If it is really critical to a person to calibrate something, he or she will do it. Motivation plays a role. If, in a certain situation, a person understands that if he doesn't notice how something occurs, something awful will happen. He will miss an opportunity. Concentration caused by motivation encourages performing better calibration.
Keeping focus. Okay.
It is also worth pointing out what you should pay attention to. There is an NLP term, sensory acuity. It's not some abstract. For example, some people, while looking at somebody, can say that she has kind eyes, or, for example, he is happy, but it's not a description, it's not calibration. A measurable description could be considered as calibration. For example, the word kind can have certain connotations, explanations, meanings. Someone believes those to be kind eyes, while another one considers them to be tired eyes. The objective in this situation is exactly to describe something in detail, very definitely, like a question from an once popular advertisement. How many grams should it weigh? It should be a description in terms of centimeters, of motions, of color, for it could be literally measured and handed over without any distortion. If a description is not sensory, it includes certain filters of a person. So these three, nearly four prerequisites, prior conditions required for we could properly calibrate another person or an object or something else.
Let me sum up. I'd like to summarize what you said. It's very interesting to follow you, but I'm sure that the focus of attention of our listeners get misled somewhere. So I have missed one, for instance. You have said four, but I have only fixed three. So emotions only do harm, only do bad. So preferably non-emotional, staying non-emotional. Second, what kind of motivation you've got. The third is it must be measurable in centimeters. What's number four? What's number four again? No emotions, having motivation, to be able to measure it. What's number four?
Number four, it should be very acute sensory.
Okay, to have sensoric feeling. And sensoric, as Alexander has said, is not evaluative vocabulary like beautiful, wonderful, but it's something which we could measure. Right. Okay. I'm sure there are a lot of exercises, a lot of examples we may do to improve the skill of calibration. Would you maybe come up with one or two possible exercises to try ourselves in calibration?
Сейчас в современном
Nowadays, in our electronically and technically advanced world, we can quite easily train almost any skills and abilities. For example, not only memory, attentiveness, logic, but calibration as well. There are some applications that you can use to develop, for example, your color perception. I love Hue application very much. It allows you to improve your color gradient perception. You have a, for example, 10x20 colors matrix, a red to blue gradient color scheme, then all segments are replaced and mixed, and your task is to restore this matrix and get back a smooth color gradient. And for example, when you have free time, it takes on average about 3 to 5 minutes per matrix. You can develop a very good color gradient calibration. If you don't have a device or an application, you can practice with a partner. For example, when you are in public transport, there is a person sitting in front of you. Both of you look at, watch that person without appearing to do so, and then ask each other question to figure out what details each of you have noticed. For example, how many buttons, or whether or not that person has a watch, how many rings, the ability to pay attention to details that there are everywhere around us is also a good ability. Sometimes, for example, when I see a certain person, for example, standing in a queue on public transport, taxi, you watch and start noticing those details.
Sure.
There is a French proverb, God and the devil are in the details. You start seeing those details, and sometimes you get somewhat disappointed with the world. On the one hand, the world is great with its diversity, but there are some inaccuracies which are unnoticeable at first sight. These are visual parameters.
Это визуальные параметры.
Yeah, let me repeat for our audience. I love Hue. I love Hue application on your phone. I have tried it once. So download and write in the commenters later how it was. Did you like it? It's a cool one. So those were visual. Audio maybe? Others?
Аудиально это
Auditory
музыкальное
refers
образование.
to music
Я уже сказал,
education.
мне это
As I
первая
said, this
способность пока не
exceptional
доступна.
ability is
Okay.
unreachable to
Слышать.
me yet. Ability to
Например,
hear,
ноты.
for example, notes, like in solfeggio,
Ты специально
when you
тренируешь
train your ear to
какая-то
distinguish
нота.
notes.
Но это пока
It
в
is
общем
some
для
kind
восприятия,
of
так сказать, база.
a basis
Но
for your
если мы берем
perception.
практическое
But if
какое-то
we are
применение,
talking
допустим,
about some
определения,
application in practice, for
то
example,
мы можем
we can study the
исследовать,
ability to
допустим, какую
recognize
способность
whether or not a
дает или
person
не
is
дает
lying,
человек. Потому что, в
because
принципе,
basically
у
it
неподготовленного
is quite
обычного
noticeable
человека тоже
when
достаточно
an
заметно. Мы
untrained
можем
person is
услышать
lying.
в его речи,
Absolutely.
We can hear it in
если взять и
his or her
специально
speech if we
натренировать.
get trained
Допустим,
in
в
it.
коммуникации.
For example, in
Можете сделать
communication, you
такое
can do an
упражнение
exercise with another
вдвоем, втроем
person
или
or
даже больше
two or even more
количество людей,
people.
когда
At
вы
first,
сначала
you ask a
просите
person to say
человека
3 to
сказать
5 phrases which are
3-5 фраз,
true,
которые
which are really about that
правдивы,
person.
которые правда
For
действительно
example,
про
I
него.
live on the fifth
Это может
floor.
быть, я
I have a
живу
car,
на
a
пятом этаже, у меня
Mercedes-Benz.
есть автомобиль,
It's
Мерседес,
true.
это правда.
3 to 5
3-5
phrases
каких-то
which
фраз,
are
которые
really
действительно
true.
правда.
Then you ask a
Затем вы
person to
просите
say 3 to
рассказать
5
человека
phrases which are
5 фраз, которые
definitely
точно
false.
неправда.
For example, my name is
Допустим, меня
Peter, I
зовут
live in
Петр,
St. Petersburg, and I
я
am
живу в
32.
Санкт-Петербурге,
You are
мне
telling
32
not
года.
truth.
Говорите
After
вы
people
неправду.
have heard and recognized
И
the
после того,
difference
как
between the
люди
first and the
услышали
second
разницу
series
между
of
первой и
phrases,
второй
they can distinguish.
типами фраз,
When that person delivers any
то дальше уже
information
можно
and we
определять,
don't know whether
когда
it
он
is
говорит
true or
какую-то
false.
информацию, мы не знаем,
In this
правдивая
situation,
она
it is
или нет.
important to distinguish
Здесь
what a
важно
person is
не
saying
по логике
not by
определять
logic,
человека,
but by
а
what you
по
have
тому, что
heard,
вы услышали.
because using logic,
Потому что
you may
логикой вы
try
можете
to
догадываться,
guess.
ну, откуда вы
Although
говорите,
you
что
don't
я
know,
же знаю
you
его, я не
haven't
видел,
seen.
например.
You should pay
Вы не
attention
обращайте
not to
внимания на
logic,
логику,
but
обратите
to what
внимание
you
на
have heard,
именно то, что
because
вы услышали, потому что
there are
есть
differences.
отличия. Отличия в
Differences in
громкости,
terms of
отличия в
loudness,
скорости,
differences in
отличия
terms
в
of
высоте,
speech rate,
отличия, например, в
differences in
каких-то
terms
других
of
более
pitch
тонких
level,
характеристиках,
differences in
что
terms
когда
of,
человек врет,
for
он может,
example, some
например,
other
говорить немножко
fine
тише,
scale
под конец,
characteristics.
или, например,
For
начнет покашливать
when a
или
person is
прикасаться,
lying,
допустим,
he or
к
she may speak in a lower voice,
частям
in a
лица,
lower voice
как это
at the
бывает
end,
иногда, пытаясь
or
тише
start
сказать, чтобы никто не
coughing
входился.
or
Или, например,
touching, for
начнет
example, some
покашливать или
parts of his
прикасаться,
or her
допустим,
face,
там, к
as it happens when you try to
частям
say
лица,
something in a
как
lower
это
voice
бывает иногда,
for someone
пытаясь
else
тише
couldn't
сказать,
hear
чтобы
it,
никто другой не услышал.
Yeah. Mhm.
И так далее. То есть
and so on.
задача
The goal is
тренировать
to
так, чтобы
develop
этот
this
навык
skill
еще
so
имел
that you
какую-то
could use
практическую
it
пользу.
in
Не
real
просто
world practice,
уметь
not just
услышать,
to be able to
следовать
hear a
этим звукам
sequence of
или
sounds or to
определить
define
их,
certain
как это
color,
применять
but
в
to
жизни.
use it
Потому
in
что
real
помните,
life.
третий
For
способ, второй способ
I
настраивать
should
режим
remind
правильной
you the
калибровки
third,
—
the
это ваша
second
мотивация.
prerequisite of
Вы
a
начнете
proper
слышать тоже
calibration
больше, и
is
видеть
your
больше, слышать больше.
motivation.
И, казалось
You
бы,
will
в
begin
одних и
to
тех
see
же
more and to
ситуациях
hear more
привычного
and
мира
begin
вы
and
поймете,
being
что мир гораздо
at
больше, чем вам
seemingly
кажется,
the
что вы
same
растеряете.
situations in the
Больше
habitual
видеть больше,
world.
слышать больше.
You'll
Казалось бы,
understand
в
that
одних и тех
the
же
world
ситуациях привычного мира
is much bigger
поймете, что
than
мир гораздо больше, чем
that
вам
it
кажется
seemed
на
to
первый
be
раз
at first
взгляд.
sight.
I think a hunter in the forest hears very well when he needs to hear sounds of wild animals like bears or whatever, and he hears the grass, the leaves of trees, and he can maybe identify, is there a snake crawling or whatever. Here is the skill we can apply to life, isn't it? Right? A hunter
Ну
or a
да,
zoologist, whatever. Not only a musician. Mhm.
это может быть и
It may
кинестетическая
be
калибровка.
kinesthetic calibration,
через
calibration through
прикосновение.
touching.
Я думаю, самый
I
простой
think
пример —
the
это
simplest
когда вы
example is when you put several
карман
coins into your
насыпаете
pocket and try
монеты
to recognize
и
that exactly coins those are,
определяете, что это за монеты,
you can
которые у вас в
rather
руках.
accurately
И достаточно
figure
точно
out
можно
with
определить
your
на кончиках
fingertips.
пальцев.
It may be olfactory and gustatory calibration when you can define the sort of wine, red or white, sweet or dry, by order and taste. And after completing a sommelier course, you will be able to define what kind of wine is this, the grape variety, on which slope and of what mount it grew. I remember I once did a special exercise when you buy the Isabella grape and Isabella wine, and then you take a little sip of Isabella wine and then eat an Isabella grape, and you feel how wine turns into grape, and vice versa when you eat a grape and then drink some wine and feel the wine, its dense taste. And this calibration of the tiniest differences. You can team up with somebody else and buy 3 to 5 types of chocolate, types of wine, or of some other product, and ask, at first we are testing the correctness, the same as with telling the truth or lie, and then we try to distinguish. We taste the first chocolate bar, a little bit of it, the second, the third, the fourth, and then we're given a piece of some of those chocolate bars, and our task is to define what type of chocolate it was, number 1, 2, 3, or 4. And gradually we are training, expanding our range of perception and making the world more sensible and interesting.
Yeah, Alexander, I remember once in one of your interviews you said that you are able to touch the coin and say which side of the coin it is. You said that.
I can do
Yeah,
it.
you can.
I can demonstrate it even right now. I have a 5-ruble coin in my hand. I can toss it.
Alexander is holding a coin in his hands right now at the moment, so I am a witness. I am watching it.
And I can distinguish heads and tails with my eyes closed. For example, this is the head side and this is the tail side.
Yeah, exactly.
Everyone can feel it.
I can't. I definitely can't do it. But I will try,
You take a 5 or 2 ruble coin and, using only your fingertips,
This is eagle, isn't it? Here is eagle. Eagle?
Yes, right.
I think it was just a coincidence. I am not good at that, really. But okay, how long time did it take you to achieve this skill, to be able to feel it?
I have rather well-trained fingertip sensitivity. I don't know why. Historically, maybe because I hadn't very good auditory sensitivity, my visual and kinesthetic sensitivities developed better. I remember about 20 years ago, I was reading Perfume by Patrick Suskind. Before the namesake movie was made, I thought it was great to distinguish many things by smell, and I was developing my olfactory perception skills, not necessarily using perfume. It could be food, other flavors, including wine or tea. I was training, and eventually I built some kind of a habit. Before I eat food, I should smell it. When I enter a room, I primarily feel it through its smells. Of course, the olfactory and gustatory sensitivity of a person who has had COVID-19 are much lower, but everything could recover. Training and practice will bring everything back, because nervous tissue will recover when trained. The simplest example of emergence of nervous tissue where it didn't exist. Those who usually have their phone in their jeans pocket can feel when their phone is vibrating by their right or left thigh. Earlier it was difficult, but now it's easily, because it's basically you develop your sensitivity this way. Subject to a proper training, you will be able to easily develop any of your perception channels.
Okay. I think the more channels of perception we have developed, the more aware a personality we are, and the higher quality our life is. So, the more channels of perception, the better. It's a very worthy thing. It's very cool what Alexander has said now. For instance, mine is audio. Audio is my best developed channel of perception. Second, maybe kinesthetics, I don't know. So, yeah, I realized that.
Kinesthetic refers to not only touching, but to vestibular system as well. Those who are dealing with their body, for example, dancers, mountain climbing, or rope walking, can develop kinesthetic awareness, improve the vestibular system, or, for example, we have other channels of perception which are not awakened as yet. For example, we can accurately define where north, south, west, and east are. It is a built-in ability. It's not clear how it works. Maybe it's an atavism that remained from birds, which indeed have a special part of their brain which can distinguish where north, south, west, and east are. They can feel it. They feel the magnetic field of the Earth. I believe it works the same way in humans, and subject to a proper training, I should remind you once again that you should have motivation. What do you need it for? We can also fill time. We can develop this skill, and people working in conditions when minutes matter, for example, some countdown, they feel a minute without looking at their watch. It is also time perception, a standalone perception, which also can be developed. The question is, what for?
Okay, so what we are moving towards is emotions, feeling emotions. The question I've got is, I think it was rather easy to observe and to identify which emotion a person is having on his face right now. But today, in 2021, when every second person has got a Botox on his chin or whatever, forehead, how is it possible to identify the emotion on the face? What would you say to that?
We can define emotions not only by facial expressions. However, if a person has buttocks or some other deformations or improvements, we can anyway define his or her emotions. But we have to be a little bit more sensible. We can define emotions by voice. For example, I think you can easily define whether a person you have a phone conversation with is angry or joyful. Every emotion can be displayed not only through facial expressions, but through breathing, voice intonations, or even gestures and body motions. You can define emotions not only by facial expressions, but if you watch a person very well, attentively, you will be able to define emotions even when that person is wearing a mask, a sanitary mask, and you can see only his or her eyes. I've seen an advertisement saying that a mask doesn't prevent you from seeing other person's emotions. Something like that. It features faces of men, women, and children expressing certain emotions while wearing a mask and having put it off. Yes, indeed. It is very easy to define emotions only by eyes, only when we see the eyes zone, but don't see the nasolabial triangle or anything else.
Which you said is very important in one of our last podcasts. Right. The last point I'd like to touch upon, speaking of calibration today, is how we hear other people, how attentive we are to speech of other people. And here I'd like to remember of predicates again. Lastly, you mentioned predicates. And you said that the more often we listen to another person, the better we understand his values. So, here again, which words the person uses, which predicates he uses in his speech, it tells us a lot, doesn't it? So, how can we use our calibration here in listening to another person?
Yes, we can hear and distinguish not only loudness and speech rate, but pay attention to what people highlight using words, putting certain emphasis, rising or lowering their pitch level, or pronouncing certain words more distinctly. You can notice that in a person's speech, you can hear it, you cannot but pay attention to it. I'd even recommend that you should exercise collaboration, such a strange recommendation. You should drill aspects separately. Take a video interview of an ordinary person, not an actor, not a policeman. Disable sound and just watch his or her face, facial expressions, gestures, and try to define what he or she feels, what that person wanted to say, what he or she is talking about. After that, you can listen to the interview, just listen to it, paying attention only to sounds uttered by that person, to the words that he highlights, to moments where he takes a pause, why he began to speak in a lower voice at some moment, or louder, where he stopped controlling his speech and began to get involved into a conversation. It's also important. It is what you should develop permanently and always. And you should develop your smell and taste perception skills. This will expand your so-called perceptual map.
Yeah, I think what you mentioned about calibration of words is very useful for negotiators. At negotiations, this is exactly what is useful and what we need to train. So today we have spoken of so much of importance: audio, visual, kinesthetics, verbal, feeling, sense, perfumes, lots of things, how to train it. So, dear listeners, dear audience, please put down below in the commentaries, what are you very observant at? What are you good at? Where are you an expert? It will be very interesting. What are you able to identify? What differences? Let's share down below in the commentaries. And thank you a lot to Alexander today again. Thank you, Alexander.
Thank you, Olga. Thank you, listeners. You are welcome to like and to repost this video. We'll meet again during the next podcast. Goodbye.
Hear you next time. Bye.